Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
Okay, welcome back to the Gay Buddhist Fellowship on July 16th, 2023. It is our custom to go around and say our names, but first, is there anybody who's joining us for the first time or back after a long absence?
Back in 3D, off the screen.
Welcome back.
First time, David.
Hi, David. Welcome. So, my name is Cass.
My name is Henry.
Luis.
Jeremy.
Jeff.
Ty.
Stephen.
Matthew. Kevin.
I'm Brian.
I'm George.
And George again.
I'm Risha.
Bob.
Jack.
Hey, Richard.
I'm Tom.
I'm Tony.
Jim.
Is anybody joining us on Zoom for the first time? Okay, well, it's a pleasure to welcome René Rivera as our speaker today for part 2 of the Intimacy in the Dharma series. It was begun last week by Reverend Bhagavan Gaither, and he will be joining us and René next week for part 3. So René is a meditation teacher, restorative justice facilitator, and leader, working and learning in all of the spaces in between race, gender, and other perceived binaries as a queer, mixed-race trans man. René teaches heart-centered, trauma-informed meditation at the East Bay Meditation Center and other meditation centers. He has co-led the first residential meditation retreats for transgender, nonbinary, and gender-expansive people. René is a restorative justice facilitator for the Ahimsa Collective, working to heal sexual and gender-based violence.
Great. Thank you so much for that welcome. Really delighted to be here with you all today. And as I was already said, my name's René. My pronouns are he, him. My home Sangha is the East Bay Meditation Center, and I'm a core teacher there. So last week, for those who were here, Daigon shared so beautifully about how our practice with ourselves can be a place to cultivate this sense of intimacy in the Dharma. And so just like touching back into that, the way that really showing up to that relationship, that moment-to-moment relationship, whether we're on the cushion or off in our daily life, is really the ground for cultivating intimacy in our lives. So today I want to focus actually on how we bring that intimacy and awareness into our relationships with others. So another way to say this is I'll be focusing today on relational practice, on how we bring our mindfulness into relationship. This is a topic that I teach a lot on. I've taught a course a number of times at the East Bay Meditation Center called Finding Liberation in Relationship, which I co-teach with Dawn Haney, where we really explore this topic of how we bring our practice into our everyday relationships. And not just our intimate or romantic or sexual relationships, but our friendships, our colleagues, our family, all of the relationships in our day-to-day lives. And I also want to just say, for me, this practice of cultivating intimacy with myself and others also extends beyond the human world. So it's also about cultivating intimacy in my relationship with the earth and the natural world. That's been a lifelong practice for me, is really feeling the connection and intimacy that I have with the earth and with nature. I also think of the unseen world with cultivating intimacy in my relationships with my ancestors, with deities, with my guides, inner guides, and others that that support me. So, there's so many realms, and I think also there's, in terms of human relationships, there's also the intimacy of relationships with teachers and mentors that has been really important in my path. So many areas where this shows up. But today I want to really look at this piece of relational practice, practicing in relationship. And I wanted to start by grounding back into the Four Foundations of Mindfulness. In some ways, that was what I really received in Daigon's talk last week, is this piece around our intimacy with ourselves is showing up in these four foundations, in bringing our mindfulness to our body, in bringing it to Vedana, or pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral, really noticing the things that we grasp onto, the things that we push away, noticing it in relationship to our thoughts, as well as in relationship to the dhammas, things like working with the hindrances. So really kind of building on this foundation of the Four Foundations of Mindfulness, or the Satipatthana Sutta, I wanted to start there also with how we might think about our practice in relationship with others. So in the Satipatthana Sutta, I have this book that I come back to over and over, Satipatthana, the Direct Path to Realization. This commentary by Venerable Bhikkhu Analayo is just such a beautiful exploration of this core teaching. Within that sutta, there's what's referred to as the refrain. There's a series of phrases that are repeated a number of times through the sutta, and that begins by saying, so this would be in the section on the body, in this way, in regard to the body, they abide contemplating the body internally, or they abide contemplating the body externally, or they abide contemplating the body both internally and externally. And so this is one piece of this repeated section, which just points to a few pieces which Bhikkhu Analayo really says is kind of like the modus operandi of this sutta. It's like, here's how to operate this sutta. And so it's pointing to this piece around internal and external, pointing to phenomena arising and passing away, pointing to just our bare awareness and continued mindfulness. And then the last piece is pointing to kind of our independent experience without clinging. So it's just these few pieces that are brought in over and over again. So what that means to me is this piece around internal, external, and both is a key piece of this practice of mindfulness. And Analayo goes into a lot of different interpretations, because it's like, well, what did the Buddha mean when he was pointing to this? And so first I'll have to say we don't really know, because, there's some commentators that say, oh, this is about the inside of the body, like the internal part of the body and the external part of the body, where others say, oh, it's our thoughts and our ability to read other people's thoughts through mind reading. So those are just like a few interpretations, but what I really, in practicing with this piece, now for many years, what it really means to me is that the Buddha is pointing to our relationships with others, that we bring our mindfulness to ourselves, bring our mindfulness to others, and cultivate this capacity to be both with ourselves and others at the same time. So for me, it's been this, when I first encountered this, I was just like, it felt like, whoa, my mind was blown that this is part of the mindfulness practice, that I would be noticing my own awareness and noticing another person, and to be able to hold both of those in my awareness at the same time. And I think in the beginning I was like, wow, that sounds really hard. Like, I noticed as I touched into it, like, oh, I can hold my awareness here with myself. I can be, listening to a friend and really have my full awareness on that other person. And I might even notice if I check in, is my awareness with myself in this moment? And I might notice it's not. Like, I'm really fully in this other person's story. So how do I cultivate this ability to be in myself and fully present with another? And I think this is what is being pointed to in this practice. And I think, so I'm not the only one who's focused in on this piece. I know folks are familiar with Gregory Kramer, who's developed insight dialogue. So within the Theravada insight tradition, there's this book, Insight Dialogue, The Interpersonal Path to Freedom, by Gregory Kramer. And there, he's laid out practices for how we can actually bring our mindfulness into connection with another. And that is really looking at things like a vipassana out loud practice. So this is very grounded in insight or Theravada or vipassana practice, that we are connecting with another person, that we're sharing our moment-to-moment experience and being witnessed, being held in that connection as we're exploring our own experience. And just noticing even what shifts when we're doing that. If folks have done a Vipassana out loud practice before, it's very interesting to notice how much is going on, the filter of speech, the question of what do I want to have witnessed right now and what don't I want to have witnessed within my own experience. And it really brings you into the moment to be sharing with another person. And then there's also a process within this framework of insight dialogue of really using the connection to bring insight. I was just recently practicing with this, and it's just was struck what a very powerful practice it is, just to have another person ask you questions in this kind of meditative, mindful connection, and notice what comes up and the vulnerability that can be there. So this has been something I've found really helpful in exploring connection in a more formal practice. And then I think there's the kind of then we get into the daily life practice, the off-the-cushion practice. We are in connection with people all the time, whether it's our coworkers, our partner, friends, family, so many opportunities to practice. And so then how does that show up? How does our mindfulness show up in those connections? And a book that's another resource that's just been very helpful for me is Larry Yang's Awakening Together, really looking at how we can be in practice in our communities, and especially across difference and all that arises when we're really coming to community and relationship with curiosity, interest, and openness to those who are, hold different opinions, who have different life experiences. And he, in many ways, is talking about the experience of the creation and life of the East Bay Meditation Center, which has now been around for almost 20 years. And I've been part of that community for 15 years now, and there's been so much learning in showing up to those community relationships as a place of practice and a place where I get so much reflection back of, here we are in our own self-awareness, and often other people are seeing something very different. We have our intentions. One of our core agreements and values at the East Bay Meditation Center is that we notice the difference between our intentions and the impact that they may have. So many opportunities I often think of it as enlightenment, when we get a chance to hear from another person how our actions have actually landed. And often it's quite different than what I intended. I noticed just the other day I had a meeting with a couple of other teachers to plan for a retreat, and I was I was actually just feeling really tired and a little irritated, and I was just doing my best to not be irritable. Okay, I'm irritated on the inside, but I'm going to show up and pay attention and be attentive. And then one of the folks, both were good friends of mine, was like, René, what's going on? My intention of hiding my irritation had not been successful, as it so often isn't. Of course people know when we're irritated. And I was just like, oh my gosh, I'm so tired. I'm processing a bunch of grief about family, and yes, there's all of this that's also present. I'm feeling really irritated. But it actually even the question, that curious question from a friend, actually dropped me from the irritation actually into some grief that was present. And without that curious question, I would have just stayed in this one layer of the irritation. So there's so much just in that moment of one, I'm not fooling anybody. And two, there's all this underneath, and I just needed a curious, companion to point me towards. It was just like a beautiful moment of awakening amidst my day of meetings. So there's just so much here in this practice, just bringing our mindfulness into our relationships, and I want to also, say in my own exploration, I'm very curious how this also shows up in our more physically intimate relationships within sexuality and touch. And those are the things that often don't get talked about, at least within the insight tradition, I will say. Those things don't get talked about. In other traditions, and maybe particularly Tibetan Vajrayana practice, there's much more of that understanding that no part of us is left out of our practice, and that this mindful awareness of ourselves and others is going to extend also to our sexual connections, to our sexuality with ourselves and with others. And so I just want to point to that, because for me, I don't want to leave any part out. And at the same time, I think it's been a little bit of a challenge for me to find where are there trustworthy places to actually explore this connection of practice, mindfulness, and sexuality, because there's a lot out there where that connection is really being, I would say, packaged and commodified, because it's something that a lot of people want. And so how do we find really trustworthy ways to practice around this connection of our mindfulness practice within relationships and in our sexual lives? And I think one place that I've been learning and practicing has been with a group called School of Consent, and it's led by Dr. Betty Martin. She recently published this book called The Art of Receiving and Giving. And she's been working in this area of really embodied consent for for a couple of decades now, and she comes out of the lineage of really learning from the Body Electric School, Joseph Kramer. And so I sort of mentioned this is not a part of our Buddhist tradition at all, but there is this lineage of practice that goes back to the AIDS crisis. When I think I sort of like, I'm embarrassed to even tell you all about Joseph Kramer because I'm sure many of you know much more than I do. But just to point to the way that Joseph Kramer was in the AIDS crisis, really wanting to create a connection of what I would call a mindful exploration of touch and sexuality, and bringing touch to men with AIDS at a time when it was so taboo to even talk about touch. And there was, such a pervasive sense that, because people didn't understand how AIDS was, how the virus worked, there was such a fear around touching gay men. And so for Joseph Kramer to come along and actually really create a modality that he called Taoist erotic massage that was really about bringing touch and pleasure to men with AIDS. This is a very powerful lineage that's actually had a huge impact from that origin. There's been many different schools of sexological body work and somatic sex education that have kind of grown out of Joseph Kramer's work. So it's been very, very influential. And so I point to that as kind of another place of practice. It's not within our Buddhist tradition, but is very much about bringing our mindful awareness to our bodies, to our experience, going through the lens of pleasure, but bringing a lot of the same questions that we bring to our suffering, actually. The questions of, what I find really interesting about Joseph Kramer's work is that he looks at kind of these questions of pulling apart pleasure and desire so that we can look at what actually feels pleasurable. We may have a lot of scripts around what we desire, our kind of erotic mapping, but he really looks at if we set that aside, he often works in pleasure and arousal but not orgasm. So that's kind of an area where you can start to really look at what's there, what's actually pleasurable when we start to disentangle from a certain drive towards orgasm or towards our kind of erotic mapping. So anyway, it's really interesting. It could be a whole nother talk just to dive into that. But I have been in this school of consent just learning this. It's a very embodied practice. It's not really as much a conceptual framework as it is an experiential framework. And so I've been just thinking a lot about how to bring together mindfulness with this particular set of practices around consent and exploring our pleasure and exploring what we want. And I think there's just a lot there. So that's maybe a bookmark for another day or another talk. But I think there's so much in our I have noticed in particularly the insight lineage where we really focus on gaining our insight through our suffering. And I think there's also really a path there to gain our insight through pleasure as well, and particularly in connection with others. I'm just going to pause there for a moment. Yeah, so I think the other thing, just to sort of shift gears a little bit, that I wanted to bring in is some of what I have learned about relational practice through my work and study as a restorative justice practitioner. So I facilitate what I like to call really hard conversations between people where there's been some trauma, harm, and particularly around sex. So sexual assault, sexual abuse. And that's, I feel like I have learned so much both in both in study and in practice, studying what's called restorative justice practices, also transformative justice, which is each has slightly different nuances. I'm not going to go into the similarities and differences, but just to say that all of these practices are around like how do we find a way of working through harm, violence that doesn't involve a punitive or carceral system. So we could also talk about it as abolitionist, really working towards the abolishing prisons, abolishing these punitive systems. So if we don't rely on those systems of punishment, then what are the alternatives? And these practices of transformative and restorative justice are really those alternatives. And so this is like another place where you really get to practice when I'm facilitating these conversations, really get to practice with sort of relationship, practice with holding myself while I'm also really holding other people in some really hard conversations and hard explorations of their own experience. And through that, I found a few areas where I feel like the same thing that we're talking about of this, what the Buddha pointed to, of bringing our mindfulness to our internal experience, our external experience, and both really show up. So the first one of those, for me, is accountability. So I would define accountability as just taking responsibility for our choices and the consequences of those choices. Those are actually words from Kiyomi Fujikawa and Shannon Perez Darby, who are transformative justice writers, practitioners. And this kind of ties in also with the value of intent versus impact. Part of how accountability shows up for me is just that I'm very interested in how are my choices, words, actions landing with someone else. That I want to always be bringing my curiosity to that and inviting feedback. And so for me, this very much connects with though it is different, with this idea of karma, with the 5 remembrances, especially the last one, which in one version is, I am the owner of my actions, heir of my actions, actions are the womb from which I have sprung, actions are my protection, whatever actions I do, good or bad, of these I shall become the heir. So for me it really connects with this practice of accountability, of just wanting to show up, to understand what has been the results of my actions or words on another person. So it's really that, stay with my own experience and really open to the experience of another, even in a moment of difficulty, even when that person may have something difficult to tell me about how my actions have shown up. And then another place that I find can really practice with this piece of internal, external, and both is with practicing boundaries. So this is a place where we get to really be aware of ourselves, our own needs, and also kind of open to the needs of another. Prentice Hemphill, who's a somatics practitioner and leader in the Black Lives Matter movement, says, boundaries are the distance at which I can love you and me simultaneously. So it's interesting. It points again to this holding both. I'm holding myself and what I need, but I'm also really caring about our relationship and our connection. And I want to find the space that I need to be able to care about both. And so one way this showed up for me is in the last years of my father's life. He was quite a difficult character and a narcissist, and there were many times in my life where I was like, I can't deal with this relationship. I actually can't be in contact. But as he, in the last 10 years or so, I knew the end was coming, and I really, really wanted to have that relationship. Like, it was really valuable to me. And so I started to figure out, like, what works here? How can I show up in a way where I can be present and be present for him? And luckily, we lived kind of close to each other, kind of adjacent neighborhoods. So I really would pay attention to at what point in our spending time together did I start to check out or be less present. And I figured out it was 2.5 hours. So I decided I would be there for 2 hours and 15 minutes. And that was the amount of time I could really show up and be fully present with him. And then I would leave, I set a timer on my phone. And of course that changed and it shifted, but actually it allowed me into a relationship with him to set that boundary of time. And so there's just many other examples, but it was what it took for me to be present with myself and present with him and really feel our relationship. And it made a big difference in those last years. Another one that is another place of practice for me is consent. So it's mentioning this framework of the wheel of consent, and it's just been I've just noticed for me in bringing an awareness of consent to any touch or whether sexual or non-sexual it's a place again to really care about my own needs and the needs of another. And so actually one place this showed up for me is around hugs. So I noticed at the beginning of the pandemic, all of a sudden, we're not hugging. If you remember back, of course now we're hugging again, but there was a while there where people weren't hugging. And I sort of realized, there's a part of me that's relieved. I don't always want to hug. It's not, sometimes it's just really personal. It's my mood or it's a particular person. So suddenly there was this space and I realized, I don't always want this. And then as we moved back into hugging again, I was like, this is great. This is a place where I can kind of show up a little bit differently. And so I sort of developed a practice of when I did want to hug someone of saying, would you like a hug? But not like as I'm going in for the hug, right? Hey, would you like a hug? Not like that. I would do this thing of I'm going to lean back a little bit and ask, would you like a hug? And then feel okay, there's really space for this person to say no. It might still feel some social pressure to hug. But it just became a practice for me, a practice of this asking before hugging people that I've actually found to be a sweet place. And then when they say yes, I know this person most likely wants a hug. And it feels so much better. The hug is so much better in knowing that they've really had a chance to opt out. So, and there's just so many other ways that shows up. But it's this coming back to notice for myself, do I want a hug? Do I not want a hug? And then asking and giving that person the space to feel into, do they want a hug or do they not want a hug? And it's that kind of, again, internal, external, and both. And caring about both. I think that's another piece of this consent practice, is that I'm caring about my needs and I'm caring about yours as well. And the final category of practice for me is about feedback. And sometimes I even say the word feedback, I see people kind of I saw a few cringes. It's such a negative association. I know I have gotten such a negative association about feedback from mostly the work world of a boss is I've got some feedback for you, or One boss I had would say, "We need to go for a walk," and I would be like, "Oh no!" That always meant I was going to hear about a bunch of stuff I needed to do differently. So just like recognizing it can be a really challenging place, but it's also like this opportunity to really hear how we've shown up in someone else's experience, and we can agree with it or not agree with it. It doesn't mean we have to agree, but one of my own practices is just really finding my curiosity. Even if I'm teaching and I see someone is waiting to tell me something. Sometimes it's going to be something positive. Sometimes it's going to be something about some impact that I've had on them, and just really coming to that with curiosity. Like, I'm just really interested to hear, and want to really take the time to hear what this person has to say, because there's going to probably be some enlightenment in it, even if it's not something I totally agree with. It is still someone's experience. And that's like when someone comes to me with their experience, there's nothing but just like, oh, wow, that's your experience. Thank you so much for sharing it with me. Have I understood it? Sometimes people come with more judgment, and that can be a little more challenging. And that I kind of ask myself, can I hear in this what their experience may be? Can I hear in it, maybe their feelings or needs that are underneath this judgment? Is it possible to still bring some curiosity, even when the language might feel judgmental? So I feel like we've kind of gone through a lot. Each one of these, when I'm teaching the Finding Liberation in Relationship class, we kind of take class for each one of these things. So there's so much more to explore here. I think I'm going to just pause here and just see if there's questions, thoughts, reflections from the room, from the Zoom. Okay. Ooh, we've got a lot. I'm going to go here first, and then I see you as well. Yeah.
René, thank you so much for an excellent talk, and I'm thrilled that you brought Betty Martin into the talk, because I'm going to a queer retreat next week, and I'm offering a workshop, Ask What You Want, largely based on her work. She's got some excellent videos on YouTube. She has something called a 3-minute...
yes.
So I really, if you're even remotely interested, I really encourage you to check that out. The other interesting thing is I'm also going to be offering a massage retreat. And what I always say to the masseurs and to the client, ask for what you want. And if the client says to the masseur, would you please, your reaction as a masseur should be, thank you for giving me that information so I could give you a better experience.
Yes.
And that, of course, carries over into erotic situations, and that is always such a difficult thing for people. Like, you're not really, you're reluctant to maybe speak up and say, would you please? And to me, as the person providing the touch or that's really good information. Because if the goal is not giving that person a good experience, maybe I don't want to be in that experience.
Yeah. Such... I'm so thrilled that you know about Betty Martin already. I just feel like she's changed my life. Yes, so good. Yeah, she tells the story of one client where she asked, what would you like me to do to you? And the person's on the table, and she said they laid there for 45 minutes, and she just waited until what it was that they really wanted bubbled up. And it's like, wow. Yeah. So thanks for sharing that. All right. You're next.
My name's Matthew. I'm curious about your work in restorative and transformative justice. I'm assuming that it's part of a program. I'm really curious about how are the two people brought together?
Yeah.
How does that come about?
Yeah, great question. I have to think about how to because we could talk for quite a long time about that. So I work with an organization called the Ahimsa Collective. It's based in Oakland, and we do work both with people who are incarcerated as well as kind of outside the system, people who haven't had the justice system involved at all. And so in the case where someone who's been the victim of a crime where someone is incarcerated, we actually work through the Department of Corrections on those kinds of cases, and it always has to be requested by the person who was the victim. The victim, it's not a great word, but I'm going to use it in this case. Rather say survivor. Anyway, so they request that we assign a team of facilitators. We work with both individuals separately until we feel like the conditions are there for a healing conversation to happen, or at least that it's more likely to be healing than harmful. And then once we feel like everyone's ready, we bring them together, and it usually happens in the prison, that there's an all-day facilitated dialogue between those two people. And then we do some follow-up afterwards with people around integration of the conversation. It's very powerful when we are able to bring people together for those conversations. And then I mostly work outside the system, so people also request support. In this case, it could come from either party, it could come from the person who caused the harm, or the person who was harmed. But again, we work with people individually and work towards bringing them together. It doesn't always happen. Sometimes we work with people individually, and the healing that needs to happen happens. We don't necessarily have to have the dialogue. Sometimes there's an exchange of letters. And sometimes we work with people individually. I've in particular done kind of individual work with people who've caused harm. Often the person who they've harmed is just the boundary is absolutely no contact, so we can't have a dialogue. But there's still so much work to do. And a lot of it's the same kind of work, working with someone individually. Yeah.
René, we have a participant online has a question. Richard, could you unmute yourself?
Jeff, you're also in the queue. Okay. So let's go to Zoom next.
Two words that you mentioned, René, were feedback and consent. And feedback has always been a challenge for me because of my own tendency to be judgmental about others, and I think people are being judgmental about me. But most importantly, with my spiritual teacher, it's always been extremely challenging because it's often things I don't necessarily want to hear, but do need to deal with. And becoming aware of that has been really important for my spiritual growth. Mm-hmm. The other is about consent. And one thing I had a question about, find in talking about consent that perhaps it's better to offer a hug rather than ask if someone would like a hug, because in that sense of asking if they like a hug is asking them to make a judgment or make a decision that maybe they don't want to make. Whereas if you offer one, you're giving them the opportunity to decline politely.
Yes, absolutely. And that language, that's kind of getting back to Dr. Betty Martin, part of what she's so good at is teasing out these elements of language and the ways that we can just notice. So even when I was giving the example, and now, of course, I don't remember exactly what language I used, but you're pointing me to this piece that's so interesting. So I can say, would you like a hug? But I'm putting as you're pointing out, Richard, it's putting the onus on them to say, I want a hug, as opposed to if I said, may I hug you? And then they can say yes, I'm willing to hug you. And so you can see there's not this additional piece of making them have to be the one who wants the hug. And so that these little pieces that even I've been practicing with this this consent framework for a couple of years, and I still constantly catch myself in these these kinds of ways of making a request without actually like owning that I'm the one who wants it. You know? So it's just so good. And so thank you for pointing that out. These nuances are actually really, it may not be something that someone else notices, but it's like, oh, how can I notice for myself the ways that I'm making a request? So, yes. Thank you so much.
Like, do you feel like a hug would be another way to say it?
Yeah, but it's interesting to notice, like, this is a piece that Betty Martin really brings in, is to say, can we use actually the language of may I, like, may I hug you, or the language of will you. It's like paring it down to really direct language, and then we can notice the ways that we bring in these kinds of indirect ways of asking for things, because sometimes there's I think it's different for different people. There can be a kind of a cultural sort of pressure to to ask in indirect ways. Anyway, it's just been a place where I've also brought my mindfulness practice, is just noticing those pieces of language. Yeah. So we had Jeff had a question and Tom. No?
Okay.
All right, you're up.
I have a couple of things I want to talk about. First of all, I really appreciate you talking about the different levels between awareness of inside, outside, and other simultaneously. And I want to ask about sharing impact. I know that's really important. And I'm always concerned, is there I firmly believe in karma, and sometimes are we always responsible for the other person, for the impact? Isn't that their karma? I mean, sounds very, jaded, but who's really responsible for another person's reaction? If I am being myself or trying to be really tactful,
Yeah, so I think I'm curious even about you asking about this piece of being responsible. I would say for myself, it's been helpful for me to really know that I'm not responsible. Like, I am interested and I care, and I'm not responsible. And so one thing that I have noticed, like one of my kind of habitual reactions or conditioned reactions when someone tells me that I impacted them in a painful way is I want to fix that. I want them to feel better, right? So, and I notice I feel that conditioning come up, oh, I'm so sorry. Oh my gosh, I won't even check it against my own experience. I'll just go right to apologizing. What can I do to make this okay? And that's actually an avoidance of my own experience. But if I'm really sitting in my experience as I'm taking in your experience, then I'm going to actually, I'm going to care about your experience. I want to hear it. I might ask questions. Did I get this? Do I understand you? But in the meantime, I'm also checking in with myself. Does that fit with my experience? Does that feel true to me? And so, I really what I have worked with is, can I really show up and care about and fully hear the other person's experience without negating my own experience? That's kind of the key thing. And I find that actually often what people really, and I can think about, what do I need in a moment when I've been impacted? Often what I need is just to be heard. So can I focus on just hearing this person fully? And then often when I feel really make sure they feel fully heard, I can say, would you be interested in hearing what was going on for me? And if they're genuinely curious, and I can say, oh, well, here's what was happening for me, and it's a little different than what I think was happening for you. and that's okay. I mean, sometimes it won't be, but...
Yeah. Sometimes, as a trained therapist, I feel like I do that a lot. And there are times when I don't want to hear, and when I'm not working, that I have to, somebody, it's too long lengthy to get into particular. I don't always want to know that. It doesn't mean I don't care, but I also have to honor my own limitations.
Yeah.
And I know that there are expectations, that I'll always be the listener.
Right.
And I used to be always the listener, but sometimes I have to say no.
Yeah.
I don't want to talk about it right now.
Yeah, and that's staying with that self-awareness and the boundary. Yeah. I wish we had so much more time because I feel like there's lots more here to talk about. But I'm going to stop because I know we still have a wrapping up. So
thank you. Okay, do we have a host today?
I'm your host today. There's hot water for tea. When you're finished with your cup, you can put it in the sink and I'll take care of it. And there's some refreshments. Some people go to lunch, meet at the front door at 12:30. Everyone is welcome. I'll be going around with a Dharma bowl. Dharma means giving. And to cover expenses like honorarium for the speakers, the rent for this beautiful building. We also send out a newsletter 3 times a year, 4 times, I can't remember. And it goes mainly to people who are incarcerated. And we ask for $10 to $20 or more.
Or less. Any other announcements, Jeff?
Yes, I want to say our host today is Jerry Johns, as most of you know, and I just want to give him a big shout out of gratitude for his service in many roles he's played over the years, but in particular the last 3 years he was my vice president. I called him my MVP because I needed hand-holding at times, and he's been tremendous gift to me and all of us, whether we know it or not. So, and he resigned, but he's still in touch. And, so
you can still ask my opinion.
That's right. I freely understand. Thank you, Jerry.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Any other announcements? Okay. Well, next week, the exploration of intimacy in the Dharma will continue with René and Reverend Dagon Gaither. And I should just mention, next week is San Francisco Marathon is happening, so if you have to cross paths with the marathon, make plans accordingly.
Or just run to it.
Join the run. Okay, so can we gather for the dedication of merit?
all right. So I just invite us all to take a moment to feel our feet on the floor, feel the thread of connection and relationship that runs around this circle. May all of the merit and goodness that we have created here today through our practice, inquiry, discussion, sharing, may it be shared out with all who need it, including ourselves. In particular, may we send out this great ball of merit to all who are suffering in their relationships today, to all who are in conflict, in isolation and loneliness, to those who are suffering under oppression and violence in this country due to their identities, race, gender, sexuality, sending out our merit as a healing balm for this world and sending out our good wishes. May all beings everywhere be safe and protected. May they be well in body, mind, and spirit. May all beings be happy and experience joy. May all beings be cared for and have their needs met. May they and we know peace, ease, and well-being, and may all beings everywhere be free. All right, thank you.
Thanks, Renee. Thank you so much, Renee.
Next week.
See you next week.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to the Gay Buddhist Forum. If you would like to hear several new talks per month and be notified of upcoming speakers so you can participate live, please subscribe to this podcast, like us on Facebook, and join our mailing list by visiting gaybuddhist.org.